Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. Let's get our gardening week started by talking about gardening. I just love this time every week. So nice to see you all here. Let's begin with a question from Rick Thalian. I have a garlic plant that has developed two garlic cloves in the first leaf and the stem. Is this a miracle or a natural occurrence? Well, it is a natural occurrence, but in some regard, it is a bit of a miracle. Many bulbing plants have the bulbils. It's bulbil that will form along the stem. Garlic, the hardneck in particular, will form what looks to be the seed head at the top of the scape. Those are actually a bunch of bulbils that are developing. And occasionally, depending on the type of garlic, they'll form along the stem as well. You can plant those. They aren't cloves like we think of cloves when you dig up the garlic bulb and then break apart the cloves. A clove you can plant and then in the next year expect to get a bulb. The bulbil actually takes 2 years. You'll plant that. In the first year, it'll form to about the size of a clove. Then you save it. Then you plant it again for the next year. So, not completely a miracle. It is relatively unusual, but you'll see it in some varieties more than others. So it's kind of fun. I suggest that you just go ahead and plant those, Rick, and take advantage of that opportunity. It is kind of fun. Shout out to Carla. Thanks for being here. Nice to see you join us again. And hello to Francois Boulet from Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. So always nice to welcome our Canadian friends as well. Big Will Dog 82 is saying my wife got me a 5-tier original green stock for my birthday. Yay! Now I get to wait for my VA money to come in so I can buy supplies to fill it. That is fantastic. My videos on green stocks, of course, I'm sure you've seen, and I continue to make more because I keep discovering new ways I can use my green stocks. The most recent one I did was with flowers, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. In fact, maybe I'll have to do it as a background for a live stream one of these days soon. And because I normally use my green stocks for growing herbs and salad crops and some peppers and peas and beans. But this year I chose the basket weave one for flowers, and I absolutely love it. And the one in my greenhouse that I planted completely with strawberries, every day I'm going out to water in my greenhouse and I'm eating fresh strawberries. So I just absolutely love my green stocks. I'm sure you'll love them too. I'm so glad you've got one of your very own now. That's fantastic. Today, the topic of primary discussion is going to be pest control in the garden. Now, pests really run quite a large spectrum. They can be all those little pesky insects that we don't want in our garden. They can actually be weeds. Weeds can be pests, and our family dogs can be pests in the garden. So throw out your questions for anything along those lines, and I'll be, of course, offering tips along the way. The big topic that I want to discuss, and I haven't really discussed it a lot in previous live streams, is integrated pest management. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about. Mala's sticking her nose in to say hello. We were outside this morning already, and she wants us to go right back outside. So the questions that I would love to see you all throw at me are the ones that are focused on those pests, because particularly springtime, early summer are when we see most of the insect pests, some of the bird pests, and some of the other animal pests that pop up in our garden. Llama Llama says, I experimented with the garlic bulbils, and those are producing better than the same Persian star garlic started from standard cloves. It took 2 years, but it's interesting to see. Yes, there are some recommendations actually that say to improve the strain of a garlic is to do the bulbils. You actually can get stronger plants after 2 years than with the cloves. So I haven't done that. I'm actually planning on doing that this year with some of my hardneck garlic, but I'm glad to hear that you've experimented with it and it actually ended up turning out the way it's supposed to. Bowtie Life in the Garden. Nice to see you. I harvested 9 pounds of blackberries and blueberries this morning. Woohoo, woohoo is right. 9 pounds. That's fantastic. I have harvested hands full of my strawberries so far, and my raspberries are starting to pop up. But 9 pounds of anything is fantastic. So good for you. Sherazad is saying, what to do about an ant infestation? And so ants, so let's get into the idea of integrated pest management. So integrated pest management is, I think, a philosophy. It's a process. It's a way of approaching how you deal with pests in the garden. And one of the ideas behind integrated pest management, and I encourage that you look it up. There are all kinds of university studies. There's a lot of information from Master Gardener programs and extension offices that you'll find online. And they range from 5 or 6 or 7 different steps that we look at when we're talking about integrated pest management. And one of them, and I think it's actually the most important, is first off identifying what the insect is or what you think of as a pest. And once you identify it, you may determine that it's not really a pest after all. And so I think a couple of weeks ago, I might have mentioned that I had discovered ladybug larva in my greenhouse. Now, the ladybug larva, it looks really ugly. Many people would think that it is some type of bad bug that's going to eat your crops. And I found it on my lettuce, and it looked like it could be eating the lettuce because it would walk along the edges of the leaves. Well, ladybug larva, of course, is not a bad bug. They were on those leaves because they were eating the aphids that had attacked my lettuce. So, beginning with identification, the aphids were the pests that I wanted to deal with. The ladybug larvae were the predators dealing with those pests, and they were not a problem. And I did nothing. I did nothing to take care of the aphids because the ladybug larvae were taking care of the aphids. When we talk about ants, it's kind of the same discussion. Are they a problem? And if they're not a problem, then leave them alone. And that's generally how I approach ants in my garden. Ants have a purpose, and particularly in my landscape, my soil is terrible. It's compacted. And if ants will burrow into my soil, I see that as a good thing because they're creating all those little tunnels, and those tunnels will fill up with rainwater and with decomposing organic material. And in time, all of those tunnels that the ants build help the soil. It's not as compacted anymore, and it has more nutrients within it. So I let the ants go. Even when the ants start crawling all over my peonies, and it's a bit of a myth that the ants are raising aphids on flowers like peonies. Peonies, after or as the bulbs or the buds are forming right before they flower, they excrete a sweet liquid, and the ants and the aphids are on those plants feeding on that liquid. And so the ants really aren't hurting the aphids. They're eating the liquid on those flowers. If you've got a lot of ants on your flowers, it's the same kind of thing. Is it a problem? Are they harming the flowers? If they're just crawling up and crawling back down again, it's not a problem to me. They do that on a lot of flowers, and ants can actually be pollinators. They'll crawl up a plant into the flowers to feed on the pollen, just like a lot of other insects, and they will pollinate the flowers at the same time. So Is it a problem? This is the whole concept behind integrated pest management. Just because you have an infestation, if you have a lot of an insect, doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. If it is getting in the way, if you do determine that it's harmful, and if it meets that threshold, and this is another part of integrated pest management, is establishing the threshold for action. At what point is it a problem? And at that point, what kind of correction action will you take? I don't think that insecticidal prevention in the way of chemicals should be the first response. Look for other things that are happening. This holds true with all pests, even ants. There are other animals that will feed on those pests. So if you have birds in your garden, the birds are going to eat insects. They're going to be eating some of those ants. They'll help take care of the problem. What's your threshold? If it surpasses the threshold, then you can start dealing with a couple different ways of handling it. And so with the integrated pest management, we can look at it from the perspective of a combination typically of control. And so it's a biological control, a cultural control, mechanical control, chemical control. Those are the ways that we generally control our pests in the garden. And so looking at it mechanically, for instance, disrupting the mound of ants, if you can find where their nest is often enough to stop that problem. They've got to rebuild their tunnels, they got to rebuild their mounds, and when they emerge again, they're probably going to go someplace else because you've disrupted them mechanically by breaking up their home. And that's one way to take care of it. You can also mechanically, and you kind of can put this into the chemical control as well. If you see the pathways that ants are crawling on, if you pour some vinegar on it, if you put some borax on it, the idea is to disrupt the chemicals that the ants are using to follow that path. If you put a different chemical that disrupts their receptors, they're going to go someplace else. Or if you don't like the direction they're going, just take your foot and mechanically disrupt that path that the ants are on, and they're going to go someplace else. So those are a couple of the ways that I look at ants in the garden in particular. If it is a bigger problem like fire ants, which really can cause pain in your garden, literally, if they bite you, then you can start looking at more severe chemicals. And there's a lot of information online to deal with that. But it's an integrated approach and it's a combination of activities. So in the beginning, you may not need to do anything. Eventually, if it's posing a problem, then you can take some corrective action. And then if it becomes more of a problem, then you can take more drastic action. So that holds true with ants and virtually any other chemicals or any other pests that you would see in the garden. Dennis is saying earwigs and pill bugs are my biggest problem. And so this is, again, looking at it from the same perspective, identifying the insect. We have the earwigs and we have the pill bugs. And then I think education is a big part of it. That's not really a formal step in the integrated pest management, but I think it should be. Learning about those animals and those insects to see what their job is in the garden. And so the job of earwigs and pill bugs is to get in there and deal with the decomposing organic materials that we have in the garden. Their job, their role is to help break down that material, and it improves our soil. So when I see earwigs and pill bugs, it's generally just one or two, three or four. That doesn't even get close to what I consider a threshold of action. It shows me that those animals are in my garden and working to decompose all of that mulch, all that that compost I have in my soil to release the nutrients and make it available for the plants. Because think about all that big chunky organic material, including the compost that we use in our garden. It's too big, it's too chunky for the bacteria in particular to break it down easily. That's where all of these bugs come in. They're breaking down the big chunks into smaller chunks, and it's those smaller chunks that the bacteria are breaking down to release the nutrients so that the plant roots can absorb those nutrients. So if they are a problem, really try to identify what the problem is and then counter that with the benefits that those insects bring. Are they beneficial in breaking down that organic matter? Yes. However, if you have an absolute infestation, I saw this when I was gardening in Oklahoma, and my garden was mowed down virtually overnight, and I couldn't figure out what was doing it. Those were years before I became a master gardener, and I was still trying to figure it all out. And as I was cleaning up my garden, attempting to replant, I came across a nest of the pill bugs. Thousands of them were in this dark, damp hole on the edge of my garden. And I realized they were eating the little seedlings in my garden. So that is a problem. That definitely crosses the threshold and action is needed. I disrupted their nest and tried to spread them out, tried to kill as many as I could, and replanted, and it was less of a problem. So with pill bugs and earwigs and a lot of those crawling bugs that are doing a job of decomposing, if you want to get rid of them, if you want to try to control them, an easy way to do it is cardboard. Cardboard is one of those magic materials. If you wet the cardboard so it's nice and soggy and lay it down near the area that you have the problem with, and then go to bed that night, come back the next morning, pull up that cardboard, and you're probably going to see a lot of those pests that you're trying to deal with. And then at that point, you take the mechanical control. You can pluck them and drop them in a bucket of soapy water. You can squish them. You can put them in a plastic bag and put them in the freezer. There's lots of ways that you can deal with those kind of pests in a mechanical way. Many of them, particularly like the earwigs and the pill bugs, there aren't a lot of organic controls that you can use, and so the mechanical methods tend to be the ones that are used most. But the idea is to use a balanced approach and disrupt their nest, learn about their life cycle, see if you can disrupt it, learn about where they live to see if you can disrupt their home. There are a lot of those kind of things that you can do. It won't necessarily get rid of the problem for this year, but if you can disrupt them so that they're not reproducing or they're not able to overwinter, then next year in particular, you'll have a much better year with much fewer problems. Hi, Steve Rogers. Thank you so much for that donation. I appreciate it. Thanks for the great info. You are very, very welcome. And it's nice to have you here. And I'm glad that I can be sharing a lot of this information with you. So thank you again. That's greatly, greatly appreciated. Carla, what do you think about the cardboard as a source of toxins when used in the garden? Many are espousing this now, and I know the garden father has been. Well, so first off, if you use cardboard in the garden, yes, I would suggest not using the colored cardboard, the cardboard that is printed and embedded with colorful inks. Some of those have been shown to be metal-based. Most of the inks, like in newspapers and a lot of our mailings, are plant-based now, but that's not always the case with cardboard. But cardboard is relatively benign by itself, especially if it's just a plain cardboard. And I think it is suitable for very specific purposes. I do not advocate putting cardboard at the base of your raised beds. If you're building a new bed, you don't need to put cardboard down. Cardboard really is a very effective barrier. So if you're trying to kill weeds and you put the cardboard down and then you put mulch on top of it, sure, absolutely. It creates a barrier so water can't get to those plants, sun can't get to those plants, oxygen can't get to those plants, and it effectively smothers and kills anything underneath it. In raised beds, I like having that interchange of the soil underneath the bed and then the soil that I fill my bed with, so that I have the oxygen and the soil life and the water going back and forth. And so in most of my garden, I'm not using cardboard. But to just lay a sheet of cardboard on the surface to collect the slugs and the snails and the earwigs and the pill bugs and whatever else shows up underneath it, I think that's a great way to use a product that we might not otherwise use, and we would throw it away and would end up in the landfill. And so as far as toxins, unless it's a box that was storing something that leaked, I have not seen any studies or any evidence that says cardboard by itself is toxic. And instead, I've actually seen some research on earthworms that shows that the glue that's inside the cardboard, that glues the outer layers and then that corrugated interior, that glue is actually a food that earthworms will eat when it gets wet as well. So that's what I think about cardboard. I don't think it's a source of toxins. I have not seen any evidence that says it's a source of toxins. Instead, I've seen evidence that says it's a barrier that cuts the good stuff from the bad stuff and really isn't needed for a lot of the purposes that we assume it should be. And there's a ton of videos, even a lot of books that say when you're first starting a garden, put the cardboard down in your bed and then put the soil on top of it. Soil that's 8 inches deep or more is going to do the same job. It's going to smother all those same plants just like cardboard would, but it allows the earthworms and all the other animals in the soil to be able to go back and forth and create a transportation web within your soil, which I think is really important. And there's Jay Dixon, fantastic moderator, along with Heidi, with a link to Integrated Pest Management for squash bugs for home gardens and home scale growers. And so squash bugs are a good example. And thank you for putting that link, Jay. I've seen a couple squash bugs in my garden right now, and I've identified them because I've known them from before. One or two squash bugs really aren't a problem, and they can be fast. They can be difficult to catch, but I usually just grab them and squish them. And if you can keep them from establishing a foothold, you can really help keep them away from becoming a garden problem. Squash bugs are a good example of an insect that really doesn't, or I shouldn't say, isn't affected by many of the pesticides that are used in the garden. So a lot of gardeners that immediately spring into action with a pesticide when they see an insect in their garden, it really doesn't affect a lot of the bugs you want to get rid of, like a squash bug. One of the best ways to get rid of squash bugs, again, is educating, going to links like Jay has just posted, and understanding what they look like and what their eggs look like. The squash bug eggs are laid in a cluster on a leaf, and there's typically about 20 eggs. They're a bronze color. Compare that to the ladybug eggs, which are like a bright orange color. So when you see an egg on a leaf, it might be a good bug, like the ladybug, if it's a nice bright orange, or it might be a bad bug if it's a bronze color. And so don't automatically assume that eggs are good or bad. Learn about it, figure out what you need to do. When I see those bronze colored eggs on a leaf, I just take my thumb and I rub those eggs right off. And I've just eliminated one generation of squash bugs. If you can do those kind of things, and if you can also recognize their life cycle. So the eggs are hatching and they're becoming a problem. Right about now, the adults are laying the eggs in late spring, early summer. If you put row fabric over your plants and keep the squash bugs away, they've got no place to lay their eggs. And so that's a great mechanical control, is to be able to put a barrier between some of these pests and our plants so that they can't complete their life cycle. They're only going to lay their eggs on the squash plants or other cucurbits, like maybe even on a cucumber. And if they can't find those plants, they're unable to lay their eggs. So that's all part of the IPM mindset, is learning about the insects and then figuring out the best way to fight that insect before it hits that threshold, before it becomes a point that you really do need to take action. And then from that point on, you can virtually eliminate what the problem happens to be. And then from there, it's one of those things that the variety, this is one of the great approaches I like. I like growing a variety of plants in my garden. I've got the flowers, I've got the herbs, I've got the grasses, I've got the vegetables, I've got fruit bushes, I've got fruit trees. If you can eliminate some of these pests before they become problems, and then increase the variety of what you're growing in the garden, you're going to entice, you're going to bring in all those beneficial predatory insects that will deal with the problem from that point forward. And so this becomes a cultural control. And this is one of those methods of integrated pest management, is how you garden. And by encouraging all of those beneficial predatory insects, you're able to deal with the few pests that you have. Now, I'm going to pose a question to you. You're free to answer in the comments what you think the question is. But if you look at the USDA site, and if you look at a number of the extension offices around the country that have websites, when they talk about insects in particular, what number springs to mind? If I were to ask you, how many of these insects, what percentage of the insects that we see in our garden are considered harmful? And when you're dealing with ants, when you're dealing with squash bugs, when you're dealing with pill bugs, you would probably think that number is quite high. What percentage of those insects are really pests that are harmful in our garden? And I bet the number is going to surprise you. Less than 3%. Less than 3% of the insects that we see around us are considered harmful. And that includes insects like mosquitoes that we don't like and that are harmful to humans. When you take it a next step further as to how many of those insects are actually harmful to plants, you get closer to 1%. Very few of the insects that we have in our garden are actually harmful to the plants in our garden. And so automatically taking that pesticide spray when you see a bug, chances are that is not a harmful insect, unless you've identified what it is and you've determined that that is the appropriate corrective action for that insect in your garden. And so relax a little bit. I rarely get upset when I see an insect in my garden, and I only mildly get affected when I realize that it's one of those 1% of pests that could cause damage to my plants. And that's when I kick in with, do I need to worry about it? Are there other predators around that are going to deal with that plant before I do? And I usually have patience, and I usually wait, and I usually let those other forces take effect. The amazing thing about those aphids and ladybugs that I had in my greenhouse a couple weeks ago, first off, I did nothing one way or the other. I didn't even know I had aphids inside my greenhouse until I saw the ladybug larva inside my greenhouse. Now, I had one of my window vents open because the days were starting to warm. Somehow, they found each other. The aphids found their way into my greenhouse because the lettuce was growing and some of the lettuce was kind of weak, and plants will send out chemical signals as they start to be damaged. And I think the aphids might have picked up on that, and they flew in and they set up a home and they started eating or sucking the juices out of my lettuce. The ladybugs did the same thing. Whether they picked up on the chemicals from the lettuce or whether they picked up on pheromones that the aphids were giving off, who knows? Somehow the ladybugs found their way into my greenhouse and ate all the aphids. That's the way I like to take care of my insect management as much as possible. For just about every pest we have, there's at least one, usually many predators that are going to come after that pest and use it for food. Birds are a great ally to have in the garden. That's why I have bird houses in my garden. During the nesting season, many birds, as many as 90% of bird species, will eat insects or will bring insects for their young to eat. And so, particularly during spring, when so many of these insects are active, if you have birds that are active in or near your garden, they're going to help take care of some of these insect pests as well. So, start looking, start being observant when you see some of these insects and try to figure out is it a bad bug or a good bug? Chances are it's a good bug. Is it a problem? Chances are it may not be a problem. And if it is a problem, what course of action are you really going to take? Now, I don't want to suggest that all bugs are good bugs except for that 1%. It's about 60% of the insects we would put into the good category. And almost 40% of the insects in our gardens really aren't good or bad as far as our plants are concerned. But they are food for animals and for predatory insects. And when they're killed and their little bodies fall down on the soil, they'll be decomposed and there's nutrients there to help improve our soil. So there are just so many good things about the insects that are all around us that I rarely find something that's really a problem. And even when I do find a problem, and this gets to the cultural controls that are within the integrated pest management concept, when I do see a plant that is infested by aphids or pirate bugs or flea beetles or harlequin bugs, I've had infestations of all of those kind of bugs at one time or another. They're going to attack the weakest plants. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. So if I've got all these bugs on one plant, sure, I'll take the hose and I'll spray most of them off, but I'm not trying to eradicate them. If I can keep them on the sick plant, then that means they're not infecting or infesting any of the other areas of my garden. They're not moving to those other plants that are healthy plants. Most healthy plants are able to fight off insects with no problem. And so I let the bad bugs feast on one plant in the side of my garden while all the others are safe and not being eaten. I keep my eye on those other plants. So if I see a squash bug or any other type of pest find the other plants, then I squish it. I spray it off. I try to take that mechanical effort that is minimal to keep those insects away from the other plants, because as soon as they discovered another damaged plant, they're going to start eating it. So I think sacrificial plants really do have an important role in our garden, where you allow some of the plants to be eaten. I've discovered that turnips in my garden in particular are one of those kind of plants. They tend to attract the pests before many of the other plants in my garden. So I'll grow turnips in a couple different areas, and I'll keep an eye on the turnips. And when I see that they're starting to be attacked by something, I'll do some minimal control, some squishing and plucking. But for the most part, that is my canary in the coal mine. That's my plant to tell me if I have a problem, if I have an infestation that needs to be dealt with. And so that's a strategy that you can use. That's a strategy I use to really get a good idea of what's happening in the garden, is by having these plants that are susceptible to certain pests that you may have compared to others, and then you move forward either with a control plan or acceptance. It really can work a number of different ways. I think acceptance really does have a role in the garden. Nijo says, yes, I learned through IPM to simply put my squash seedlings out later. No problem, because they grow quick in my zone 7B until late summer. Great strategy. I've talked about this before as well. I love this strategy. And this is, again, learning about the life cycle of the insect pest. And if you can break that cycle, you can eliminate the pest. And this is exactly what I do in my summer garden, is I plant later. And so all of those spring insects that are looking to lay eggs, and then the larva will hatch and eat the seedlings, or those insects that have laid eggs in the soil or have overwintered in leaves or plant stems and are now emerging as adults in spring. If there's no plants for them to lay their eggs on, or if the larva emerges and there's no plant to eat, there isn't another generation. There aren't more insects that are going to devastate your garden. You've eliminated them. And just by waiting 2 or 3 weeks may be enough to make that difference. And so, yes, Nijo, you are exactly right on top of things. That is a cultural strategy in choosing when you put your seeds in the ground, when you put your plants in the ground, and you choose a time that does not match with the insect pest that you suspect or that you know is in your area and could cause a problem in your garden. So fantastic approach and fantastic way to deal with some of those bugs that you want to deal with. So I think that's a fantastic example of it. Leanne says, I've been battling digging mammals all spring. They enjoy uprooting my cukes and melons. I'm now putting down Irish Spring soap and cayenne pepper as deterrents. Hope it helps. And so this is one of those with the Irish Spring soap. If you don't know what that is, it's got a very strong aroma. Cayenne pepper, of course, has the capsaicin that will burn the tongue. Doesn't work on all animals, but animals that are deterred by strong smells can be briefly deterred by Irish Spring soap. Animals that don't like the stinging pepper on their tongue can be deterred by the cayenne pepper. And so those are definite ways that you can deal with some of the pests in your garden. Be aware, and deer, Irish Spring soap is famous for being a deer deterrent for the same reason, that strong aroma. It is a brief deterrent. They'll smell it in the beginning and then they'll walk away. And then when they keep smelling it, well, it's really no longer a problem. They kind of get used to it. So one of the strategies is to move and change. So you use Irish Spring soap one day, and then you switch that out for another strong aroma. Maybe bring in some rosemary or some mint, something that also tends to be a deterrent. And if you mix it up, it tends to be a little more effective. For the digging mammals, that's a big reason why I like my raised beds, is because I can put a wire mesh underneath my beds to help keep those digging animals out of the bed. That is one of those mechanical methods to keep them away from the beds and the plants that they might be digging for. Do make sure that you cover it well. When I built my big square of raised beds, I put the wire underneath it, and there was one corner, and I was short by like 6 inches. I mismeasured. I don't know what happened, but when I laid the wire down, there was a gap of like 4 to 6 inches. Put a bunch of logs on top of it. I thought, oh, that won't be a problem. And then, of course, last year I had gophers in those beds, one place. And we're talking beds that are 25 feet long, 4 of them that form a square. So almost 100 feet of the material underneath those beds, and the gophers found that gap, and it was big enough for them to crawl into those beds. So just be aware that when you use some of these mechanical methods, some of these barriers, you really got to make sure you cover the entire area, because the animals will find that gap. There's no doubt about it. So let's see, we got Dalla Yogini. Something is eating everything in my vegetable garden: spinach, beans, peppers, collards. I don't see any slugs or caterpillars. Do you know what this might be, or an IPM strategy? So the thing about insect pests is that they are very specific to the plants that they eat. So the squash bugs are only going to eat the squash and the cucumber. Or suck the juices out, whether it's an eating or a sucking insect, but they're very targeted. So you're not going to see a squash bug on your tomatoes and your peppers. It just doesn't happen that way. And caterpillars tend to be less discerning, but they are also very specific. So the tomato hornworm, that big 3 or 4 inch long fat caterpillar, you're going to see on tomatoes. You're not going to see the tomato hornworm on your corn. So if something is eating everything, chances are it's not an insect, or it's a whole bunch of different insects that are all showing up at the same time. So this is where you have to really do some detective work and look at the damage on the plant. And you can go online and find pictures of deer damage, and you can see what a leaf looks like when a deer eats it. And you can see pictures of rabbit damage, and you can see what the leaf looks like if a rabbit has eaten it. That's one way to try to identify a pest that's eating everything. If it's everything, chances are it's an animal. If it's really centralized to only certain beds are being eaten, and it's only certain plants within those beds, then chances are it's an insect that is causing that. But really, you got to get out, and you got to look underneath the leaves. You got to look on the soil. You got to go out in early morning. You got to go back in early evening, different times of day, and try to see the actual pest at work. That's one of the ways that you can find caterpillars is to go out at some time other than the middle of the day and look for that movement. You can even take a black light out and shine a black light on your plants, and sometimes you'll be able to see the pests at night that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. So identification is key. Before you take any specific action, you got to really try to identify what it is that's eating your plants. And in the case of the spinach, so the spinach and the beans and the collards, that could be the same insect eating all of those, but it's unlikely that that insect would be eating the peppers. And so it could be slugs. Slugs are like caterpillars in that they tend to eat almost anything, and they'll just crawl until they find a plant and start eating it. So go online and try to see if you can see a picture on slug and snail damage, and see if that matches the way that the leaves are being eaten. Then, if you've identified it, you can start getting to the controls. And so it's back to cardboard. Slugs in particular are attracted to the wet cardboard during the heat of the day, and after the night is over and the sun's starting to come up. They want to be protected. They want to be in a nice, moist, dark environment. So they're going to crawl underneath that wet cardboard in early morning, and you can go out during the sunny day and pull out that cardboard, and if you've got slugs, they'll show up there. So that's another way of using something like wet cardboard is not only as a trap, but also a way to determine if you have those kind of problems in your garden. Put it out as a trap so you can capture and kill them, but also put it out as a trap to see if it's even a problem. You'll see this on large scale agriculture and apple orchards, for instance. They'll put out traps to see what they catch. So hopefully they'll catch some of those bad insects right away and see that they're there, and then they can take corrective action once they've trapped a particular insect or animal. They know it, they know what it is, and then they can take the corrective action. So the specific IPM strategy begins with identifying what the pest happens to be, then determining if it is enough of a problem that it requires your action. If they're just eating some of the leaves, like on the collards and the spinach, you can still eat it yourself. Even if it has some bug damage, you can still take it into your kitchen and use it. Once you identify it, then you can determine, is it something that you can prevent from happening again by disrupting its life cycle? And then also what kind of control measures you need to have in place to be able to deal with that problem. So lots of different levels when we talk about the control and the management of those pests in our garden, but it really does begin with the identification, whether it's animal, whether it's insect. I've had leaves that were damaged in the past and initially thought, what kind of bug is eating this leaf? That's a really weird hole, and there's holes everywhere. And then I realized that we'd had a hailstorm the day before, and it wasn't insect damage, it was hail damage. So you may not even have a pest problem sometimes when you think you do, because the weather can cause some of those same things. Yellowing leaves are often assumed to be caused by a pest or disease. It could just be the way you water, or it could be that the weather changed suddenly and it's suddenly hot and dry, and the lower leaves on a plant will normally turn yellow in those situations. So there's lots of different damages that can take place, and it all leads back to trying to identify what the damage is, and then trying to figure out just exactly what caused that damage to see if it's something that you need to take action on. So lots of fun. I just love talking about the bugs in my garden and all the other things that are happening that we need to deal with. And like I said, I've just really enjoyed seeing that ladybug larva in my garden. It was fantastic. I've got the bees that are showing up in my garden now. And of course, Mala likes to chase and eat bees. So I have to yell at her occasionally. But I haven't seen a lot in my Colorado garden, but mainly because it's just waking up. I don't have my vegetable garden growing yet. This year, I had a frost after my average last frost date. And so until this week, I thought last week was going to be warm. It didn't end up being warm. It actually was quite cold in the middle of the week. But this week looks good. Now I can expect that as those young plants are going to be growing in my vegetable garden, that some insects will begin growing. So as you're in your garden and as you're observing what's going on, be aware that at certain times of year, some of those pests are more active than at other times of year. I've noticed last week and the week before some fresh deer scat, the deer droppings in my garden. Now, luckily, my fruit trees are covered with bird netting, and my strawberries are covered with wire mesh, and I didn't detect any damage in my garden from the deer. I couldn't find anything that they had eaten. That doesn't mean they're not there. That just means they just were walking through my garden and exploring and decided to leave some of their droppings behind as they were moving through my yard to someplace else. They probably found something that was tastier. That's my backyard. When I look in my front yard, my tulips have clear signs of deer damage. So the deer may know about the tulips in my front yard, and they just walk through my backyard to my front yard to eat my tulips. And then everybody else's tulips that they have in the other yards in my neighborhood. So right now, the deer are not a problem. I know they're there. Mala knows they're there, but I haven't seen any damage. That's going to change over the course of the summer, and especially moving into the winter when there aren't a lot of good food sources. They'll come back and they'll nibble on the branches of my fruit trees. So I have to be aware that I have deer in my garden. Are they a pest? Not right now. Probably not next month. Are they going to be a pest in 6 months? Yeah, probably so. So this is all part of the approach to pests in our garden. Just because they're present doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem right now. And that gets us back to that threshold for action. I'm still covering all of my fruit trees with the bird netting, just in case they want to munch on the tips. But I'm really not taking any other corrective action to deal with the deer in my garden, because I got a lot of other projects I need to do, a lot of other work that needs to be done, and I'd rather focus on some of those kind of things. Woodline worker gardening. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Hello, Gardener Scott. I planted 2 peach trees this year, 1 potted and 1 bare root. The bare root one has all the leaves eaten off. Thoughts? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I planted a new columnar apple tree, and it's struggling and barely has any leaves on it as well. So the bare root one in particular, I would be concerned about if that's the one that has the leaves eaten off. The nice thing about the potted versus the bare root is that the potted plant, or potted tree in this case, you can assume has a root system that's already developed. And so there's energy in those roots to cause the buds to pop and leaves to grow, and will encourage the growth of the tree. And so if leaves are eaten off of a potted plant, I tend to have patience because it should recover pretty well. With a bare root plant, it doesn't have that same development of a root system. You put the bare root plant in the ground, usually when it's dormant, it starts growing once those buds pop, and the leaves then create the photosynthesis that then puts the energy into the roots for the next year and for much of the growth in that first year that you're planting it. If that bare root plant has no leaves or very few leaves, it's not going to be able to get all that energy built up. It's not really going to be able to grow well in that first year. So for now, I would say have some patience, see if more leaves will emerge. And if enough leaves are growing on the tree, then hopefully it overwinters, and next year you can see how it grows. What I've discovered, at least here in my harsh Colorado winters, is when I put those bare root trees in, and if they don't have a lot of leaves, or if the deer eat the leaves, in the next year, they don't survive. They'll just survive 1, maybe 2 years, but they just don't have the energy reserves in their roots to keep on growing. So depending on where you got it, you might be able to exchange it. I am usually, because I'm so patient, unable to exchange. So I get almost all of my bare root trees online. I'll put them in the ground in early spring when they're still dormant. If they don't do real well that first year, I wait until the second year to see how well they do. By the time I find out they're not doing well, I've already missed that window. Most of the nurseries will have a 12-month window where you can say your plant's not growing or your plant died, and they'll send you a new one. I'm always outside that window because I have patience and I'm waiting to see what will happen. Oh, there's Mala again. But this is one of those situations where, depending on the nursery that you got the trees from, and depending on what they allow for when you exchange or get a new plant, this might be one of those times to just go ahead and take action and say that you've got the bare root and it's lost all its leaves. They may or may not cover it and send you a replacement depending on what kind of damage, especially if it's animal damage. But it's worth a try. I'm like a mother hen in my garden where I try to baby my plants and I try to help them survive. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I have a fruit tree that is in a new area of the garden where I put some new beds this year, and I'd written it off as dead. it had deer damage. It had a lot of the leaves that were eaten off. It had started as a bare root plant, and it was, I think, the end of that first year that it really got that damage. And the next year, I thought I'll give it a chance, and it just didn't look good. It just hadn't recovered well at all. So I bought a replacement tree. I didn't dig up the first one. I still had hope, but I planted the replacement tree just within a few feet of the one that had had so much damage to it. And I didn't want to give up. So I dug up that damaged tree, and it was only like 2 feet tall. It had been really devastated primarily by the deer. And I planted it in this other area of my garden, an area that was going to be developed with fruit trees. And I thought, I got nothing to lose. I'll go ahead and replant it. Well, it's doing great. It's got new branches on it. It's just started to leaf out. It is, I think, one of the only fruit trees in my garden that didn't flower this year, but that's because it's been struggling. It's been putting all of its energy into roots and some new branches and some new leaves, and the patience looks like it's paying off. It may be another probably 2 or 3 years before I see any fruit on it, and the tree is already 3 years old, but 2 of those years it's been really struggling to survive. But last year, when I put it into its new spot, and of course put the bird netting and put fencing around it to keep the deer away from it, this year it just looks fantastic. So there's some thoughts. You asked my thoughts. There's some thoughts on what to do if you have a bare root tree that just isn't performing, and a couple different approaches. I like to try to give them a chance if I can. Tammy saying, I had a rabbit checking out all the plants sitting in my driveway, waiting for my garden beds to be built. I shoot it away. It doesn't seem to have eaten anything, but I'll have to keep an eye on it. I've got rabbits everywhere. I got rabbits in my front yard every morning. I go out, I have rabbits there. I don't have rabbits in my backyard anymore. I did for a long time. Lily was getting so old she couldn't chase the rabbits. And so the rabbits would be underneath the garden shed. And I know they had a nest there, and I would see the babies come out every spring. And they were pretty active in the garden. But the rabbits and Lily just kind of allowed each other to survive with no issues. And even when I had a lot of rabbits in my main vegetable garden area, I never saw any damage on any of my plants. I knew they were there, but they weren't eating my vegetable garden plants. These are native Colorado rabbits, and they're eating native Colorado plants. So I let them roam around the edges of my garden. They were eating grasses and some of those weedy plants that surround my garden and doing just fine. They never ventured into any of my beds to eat any of my plants. So the integrated pest management concept, rabbits can definitely be a pest, but look at what's happening and how they're living and how you're living to even determine if they are a pest. And for me, the rabbits were never a pest. They actually helped keep some of the weeds from overtaking my landscape because they'd be eating those plants. And so that would be an area I wouldn't have to go out and weed because the rabbits took care of it. The same in my front yard where I have all those rabbits now. They live underneath a big juniper bush that I have in my front yard. They're eating the weeds. They're not eating my flowers. They're not eating the tulips. They're not eating my grasses. They're eating all of those native weeds that like to take over as soon as they have the opportunity. So I let the rabbits have this, as much leeway as I can give them. I do keep an eye on it, and I do know the difference between deer damage and rabbit damage on a leaf. Like I mentioned earlier, you can find those photos online, so you can have an idea too. And that's how I know I've never seen the damage on any of my plants from the rabbits, because they're not eating the leaves; they're eating all those other plants. But that's me. That's my garden. That's my rabbits. Definitely keep an eye on it and see if you're noticing anything that might be happening. And Rick is saying, nice rabbit being native would be okay. Exactly. Native rabbit, native plant, what do you find? So often, we get to the Peter Rabbit stories by Beatrice Potter. And one of the reasons that Peter and his sisters wanted to get into Mr. McGregor's garden is because that's where all the good stuff was. And that's the way so many of us garden, is we eliminate all of those weeds, we eliminate all of those native food sources for the rabbits, and we put everything in one area. It's like a smorgasbord. And so are they going to come in your garden and eat it if that's all they have to eat? Well, of course they will. If you allow them the plants around the edges that you don't care about, then that's what they're going to eat. Because especially if you have a dog, and that's why I know I don't have rabbits in my backyard anymore, is because Mala has done a great job of getting rid of them, of shooing them away, occasionally bringing them in. There was last year, I think it was. Last year was the last year I saw rabbits in my garden. And over the course of a week, she brought in 4 baby rabbits. And when I say in, I mean into the living room while I'm sitting in my chair, and she drops a baby rabbit at my feet. So she pretty effectively disrupted their life cycle and got rid of all the babies that she could find. And I have no doubt that the adults either moved into the front yard or moved into another yard, because there's no indication in my backyard main garden area that I have rabbits anymore. So yes, if they're native and you allow them some native space, it's a good rabbit. So I think you can turn a rabbit from being a pest to an ally if you allow it a little leeway in your garden. Serena says, we used to have chihuahuas and a squirrel would tease one of them, but eventually stopped coming. I don't see squirrels in my yard. I found pecans in my pots buried. Interesting. So yeah, I don't like a barking dog. Most people don't like a barking dog. Squirrels don't like barking dogs. So the barking dog can be a pretty good deterrent for us keeping our windows closed and for squirrels going someplace else. That's definitely one option if you have a dog that likes to bark at squirrels. And Mala's got a number of different barks, but I can tell when there's a deer, and it's usually on the other side of the fence in my neighbor's yard. She has that bark, and she's barking at the deer, and I can go out and I can know that the deer are venturing close. Occasionally, last summer there was a time, and the bark was even more extreme than it normally was, and there was a pretty good sized buck inside my garden area, and they were nose to nose with Mala barking at it. And it wasn't until I came out with a flashlight and was able to scare it away, but that buck was not being deterred by Mala's barking. So it's all relative as to the size of the pest and whether they're deterred by something that you are an ally with in your garden. And Mala's a great ally, but not against the big deer in particular. And Serena's asking, are there certain pests that praying mantis control that ladybugs don't, or do they control the same ones? So the praying mantis and all the mantids that you might find in your garden are great predators, but they'll eat everything. They eat good bugs, they eat bad bugs. And so, yes, they are a control for some of those insect pests that ladybugs don't eat. but they'll also eat some of the good bugs too. So I love them. I like seeing them in the garden. Just be aware that some of these predators are not selective. The ladybugs are pretty selective, and the ones they're eating are the small insects that are primarily the sap suckers of our plants. But the praying mantis in particular will eat everything that it can find. And so uh, if it can find food, it's going to eat it. And some of that food that it's eating is going to be the bad bugs that ladybugs and others aren't eating. But it is also one of those indiscriminate killers. So be aware of that. Even some of the good bugs can cause some damage by getting rid of some of the other good bugs. And I'm okay with that. It's a it's a garden in nature, in balance, and eventually it will find an equilibrium. And because there are so many insects, because so many of them are beneficial or are just kind of neutral and act as a food source, I'm okay with the praying mantis eating whatever it can find. And yeah, I've seen pictures. Some of them are accurate, but praying mantis, especially the big ones, uh, hummingbird is just a big moth as far as the praying mantis is concerned. And there can be some big praying mantises and small hummingbirds. So yeah, Lawrence is right that praying mantis and the hummingbirds can go to battle for or against each other. Sin Sim, thank you so much for that. Thanks for the good information. You are very welcome. And thank you for that support of the Gardener Scott channel. I definitely appreciate that. And always nice to see you here. And so want to give a shout out to Steve Rogers and to Garden Dilemma, members now of the Gardener Scott community. And I've talked about becoming a member of the Gardener Scott channel periodically. There's a link below. You can explore it. We have different perks, different levels that you can look into if you're interested. It really helps support the channel. And it does give you some of those perks that you can benefit. For instance, at the training and the collaborator level, I do monthly live streams. And so I'm going to be doing one in just a couple days for members of the Gardener Scott community. So that's one of those things that if you are interested in helping me out to be able to try new things and keep making the videos, I certainly appreciate it. And that's why I try to give some of those perks if you want to become a member of the channel. So just wanted to be sure and acknowledge those that I see have popped up today as members or upgraded members. So definitely appreciate it. Rick is saying we can share our garden with some bugs, but as long as they don't get too greedy, and that's a good way to, when I talk about establishing the threshold of when we take action. Yes, I'm willing to share my lettuce and my spinach with some bugs, and if they eat some holes in it, I'll still harvest it and put it into a salad. It's not a big deal, and that holds true with a lot of the things I grow. If you've ever grown apples in particular, apples are great to grow in the garden, and I'm really hoping for a bumper crop of apples this year, the first in this garden. But the apples you grow in your garden do not look like the apples that you buy in the store. Apples you buy in the store are always nice and shiny, no blemishes, no bruises, and that just doesn't happen in real life in the garden. So the more you grow and the more you eat that you grow, the more you're going to find that it isn't always pretty, but it's edible and it usually tastes good. And that's reason enough for doing it. And so as long as they don't get too greedy with whatever it happens to be, I completely agree. I'll let them munch a little bit. And that's well below my threshold for taking action to try to get rid of some of those plants. Jay is saying, third time asking opinion on no low bait for locusts. It's supposed to be safe for all but locusts. So I've read about that, and some of what I read says that for dealing with grasshoppers, locusts, that some of those type of chemical controls work. I don't have any practical experience. It's not something that I have ever used, and it gets down to, again, the level of damage that they're causing in your garden and whether it's a big enough problem to take action. I'm not a big advocate of using any type of uh, chemical, even if it is an organic chemical, particularly petrochemicals. I like to try to control my garden as naturally as possible. So that's the approach I take. Last year, I had grasshoppers in the garden. They ate some of my plants. Wasn't a big problem. I saw birds from my bird houses going back into their bird houses with grasshoppers in their mouth. So if it's not a huge problem, I let nature take over. But as far as an opinion, if you've got a problem and your only option after you've taken the steps of trying to take other corrective controls is the no-low, then use no-low. I'm not going to tell anyone that the way they choose to garden is wrong. It may be different than what I'm doing, but if that's what you determine is best for you because you've got a problem that has reached that threshold that you need to control, then go for it. That's definitely something to consider. One of the ways that they've used for thousands of years to deal with locusts in crops, particularly when it reaches that point that they are just, it's an infestation and they're damaging everything, is to burn the crop. The locusts are going to eat everything, so burn it before they can eat it and kill as many locusts in the process. Some of the chemical controls kind of fall into that same category, where you can either kill the plants or try to kill the insects, but you try to eliminate as many or all of them all at the same time. So scorched earth policy is an option, be it a chemical or an actual fire, depending on how big the problem is. Farmers have gone to extremes to deal with some of these problems. I like to try to take care of it through the prevention. That's a big step in integrated pest management. Prevent it from ever being a problem in the first place. There are lots of regions of the world where you just can't prevent the grasshoppers. You can't keep the locusts from flying in and devastating everything. Those are the kind of situations where you may need to take more drastic control. And that's okay. That is part of integrated pest management. It's the last step when you look at most of the recommended steps that are on all these different sites when you do your research. It is okay to use harsh chemicals if that is the point that you've reached. If you've tried the birdhouses, if you've tried plucking off, if you've tried, there are some bacterial controls. And so I haven't talked about the bacterial controls. And so the bacterial controls, as we talk about the locusts and the grasshoppers in particular, it's those bacterial controls that can be used on a lot of plants. Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacteria, and like the no-low, you put it on your plants, and it's very targeted to the insects that are eating the leaves and that are going to be affecting that particular crop. And so when you take those kind of corrective actions by targeting the insects that are only eating those plants, all those other beneficial insects, so the beneficial bugs like the ladybugs and the praying mantids, they're not eating the leaves, they're not eating the plants, they're eating the other bugs. And so if you use something that's going to kill those bugs, then you're not going to be harming the beneficial predators, because those bugs are going to eat something and die, and they're not really going to cause a problem to the good bugs that we're trying to keep in the garden. So those are a number of different ways that you can take the approach, and to the level that you want to take it, to try to have the corrective action that you need in your garden. And it's all very personal. And that's the nice thing about integrated pest management is it's a common sense approach based on you and your common sense. You do what's best for your garden, which of the principles, which of the steps, which of the philosophies, which of the methods you want to use in your garden, and design it however you want. And as long as that's working for you, who's to say that you should do something different, or you should do it better, or do it different in any way? Do it exactly the way that you want to do it. And chances are you're going to be happy with the results. There's Jay with another good link to grasshopper control from Colorado State Extension. So I appreciate that, Jay. Grasshopper control can be difficult. I like to try to catch them and pluck them off. I remember doing this with my kids years and years ago. I think I gave them a penny for every grasshopper they could catch, something like that. That's one of those ways to deal with grasshoppers in your garden, is to pay kids to catch the grasshoppers. But when it gets worse than that, yeah, turn to something like Colorado State Extension for ideas on what you can do to try to help keep things under control. Lawrence is saying, my biggest problem with a suet feeder is finding a place to put it that isn't accessible to the squirrels. I found on the third try. Good for you. I posted this picture, I think last month, on my Instagram, a picture of a squirrel on a squirrel feeder. That's what my brother and sister-in-law do. They actually have set up feeders specifically for the squirrels. It's like I was talking about earlier with the rabbits. If you give them another source of food, they're not going to be as interested in your garden. So I let the rabbits feed on the exterior with all the weeds, and they have a bird feeder on their fence, and the squirrels never come into their yard to eat any of their vegetable plants or any of their flowers or bury seeds in the pots. They're happy staying on the fence because they have a feeder of their very own. That's an option to take if you're trying to set up bird feeders, except that the squirrels are going to eat some of it, and maybe even set up one off on the side. At my last house, in my last garden, our neighbors had a ton of bird feeders. They didn't have a lot of space in their yard, and they actually set up the feeders in my yard, just over the fence. And I was fine with that. I never had a problem with squirrels in the garden because the squirrels were always hanging out at the bird feeder. Now, yes, you're paying to feed the squirrels, but it's that question of, would you rather have the squirrels in your garden causing damage, or would you be okay with them eating some of the bird feed? Or what my brother and sister-in-law do is they actually get peanuts and they'll feed the squirrels peanuts. So I don't want to have to pay for peanuts to feed squirrels, but I'm more than happy to have a neighbor that feeds the squirrels for me. And that's an option. That's one of those things that you can take care of, and hopefully it'll make a difference. Okay, let's see. Serena's asking, do you use any BT treatment for tomato hornworms, or you just let the parasitic wasps take care of them, or both? So I haven't actually had to take any corrective action for the hornworms in years. I haven't seen any at the garden I'm in now. And so I'm keeping my eye out, and they haven't been a problem, so I haven't had to take control. But I've done both. I did have some hornworms at my last garden, and BT is an easy option, just like we were talking about with the NOLO, with the grasshoppers, and with the BT for any of those insects that are eating the leaves. It can be very effective. Now, the parasitic wasps, 2 gardens ago, I went out one day and I saw it. It's awesome. If you ever see a hornworm that has all those little eggs on the back, the parasitic wasp eggs, It's incredible. I'm hoping I can see that again because it really is cool. So the BT is an action you can take to deal with it, and it can be very effective against the caterpillars. But the parasitic wasps, there really isn't much you can do other than just create a landscape that's inviting to those parasitic wasps by having all those different variety of plants. And they'll find the hornworms and they'll lay the eggs and they'll deal with it yourself. So both can be corrective actions. I've done both. And luckily, knock on wood, I haven't had to deal with that in the recent past. So we'll see. I actually have some BT ready to be used when I see any of those problems start to emerge. So it's literally in my toolbox, in my garden, or in my garage. And I'm ready to take that action if I need to. So just be aware of that. Jeanette B says last year's hornworms were plucked off and taken for a ride down the road. They were too big to squish. Yeah, I throw them over the fence to the chickens generally. If the neighbor has chickens at the last house I saw them at, I threw them over the fence because they're not going to be able to crawl back over the fence to the tomatoes again. They're going to be eaten by a bird at some point. But yeah, take them for a ride. And they are kind of big, and yes, that is one of those bugs I typically don't squish, but it's a lot of fun. If you've ever thrown a big caterpillar to a flock of chickens, it's a lot of fun to see those chickens at sport with a caterpillar. And so lots and lots of fun. Heidi says, I love parasitic wasps. They lay eggs inside aphids, and when they hatch, it kills the aphid. Yeah, the thing about the parasitic wasps, there are in your garden, you've probably got a dozen or more species at any one time, probably dozens in your garden, and you don't even know it. We think of when we see wasp, and I was asked this question. Well, it wasn't even really a question. So a couple days ago, doorbell rang. I answered it. It was a young man, and he was telling me how he was in the neighborhood, and some neighbors had their homes treated for wasps, and he was there to sell me a treatment to get rid of wasps. And I said, I like the wasps. I'm not trying to get rid of my wasps at all. And in fact, I started talking about integrated pest management. That's one reason why I wanted to talk about it today, because it got me thinking that there's a lot of people out there that see some of these insects and automatically think they're bad and think they need to get rid of them. And so when we see wasps, at least in my area, it's the yellow jacket wasp in particular. They come in, you're having a picnic, they're trying to eat your food, they're so annoying. Or the paper wasp, I have some of those. They'll build those nests with those beautiful round softball size and bigger nests with all the wasps inside. They're predators. They're in your garden eating insects that could be damaging your plants. I don't want to get rid of them. But more importantly, when I talk about the dozens of species of predatory wasps, some of them are very, very small. And so, as Heidi points out, there are wasps that are not much bigger than the size of an aphid. And they lay eggs inside the aphid, just like they lay eggs on the tomato hornworm. And the larva hatches and eats from the inside out and kills that particular pest. And so there are those parasitic wasps, and they're parasites because they lay the egg on the insect and then they become a parasite inside the insect and eat it from the inside out. But there are predatory wasps that will kill and eat the insects, not to lay eggs. And then there are parasitic wasps that are laying the eggs. There are all kinds of wasps that are in your garden that are doing this work for you. And so don't automatically assume that just because it's a annoying yellow jacket at your summer picnic that all wasps are bad. Quite the contrary. There's a lot of good wasps out there that you really should be glad you have in your garden. Some of those little flies that you see flitting around your plants, some of those are wasps. Some of those are bees. A lot of what we think of as just a little fly, most of the time it's not a fly at all. And that's where the identification comes in. And then the research comes in to learn about the insects you have in your garden. And it really is extremely fascinating as to how they work. So, yeah, bow tie life in the garden. Didn't realize parasitic wasps take out aphids. Cool. And Sandy is saying, never heard of parasitic wasps. So, yeah, it's really cool. And the more you learn about them, the more you realize that they can easily be attracted. So one of the things that I put in my garden to attract some of these beneficial insects, to include the wasps, are fennel and dill. I have dill that is a mainstay in my garden every year. This year, I actually have some fennel that I started from seed early. It's going in my garden here pretty soon. And it's those umbel flowers, those like little umbrellas when they flower and set seed. Those flowers attract a ton of beneficial insects. So planting some dill and fennel in your garden really is a good way to attract. A lot of the flowers that are on our herb plants attract beneficial insects. And then, of course, there are a lot of the flowers in our garden that you can plant to specifically attract the beneficials. Borage is one of those. I grow borage because the flowers really attract some of the beneficial insects we have in the garden. So it's all about variety. It's getting beyond the typical flowers and plants you see and really enlarging your palette of plants. And that's what's going to attract a lot of these insects that you really want in your garden. And Gina's exactly right. That's why I let some dill, fennel, parsley, and carrots go to seed. Yeah, carrots are another one. Now, carrots are biennial, so you got to wait till the second year before you get to flowers. But yeah, absolutely, all of those have that flower that's attracting, and they're covered with those little itty bitty insects. And when you get up close, especially if you have a magnifying glass, and identify some of them, you'll be able to identify some of them as wasps. It's so cool. It really is so cool. So as we end today, I do wanted to mention, so for those of you in the United States, you know that today is Memorial Day. And I'm glad some of you are visiting today. I'm guessing that some of you have the day off because it's a national holiday and you're able to join all of us on the live stream today. But one of the things, and I was reading an article in the paper today about it, is Memorial Day is a national holiday. We get the day off. We do things like go out and work in the garden, and we have picnics, and there are festivals, and it's kind of the unofficial start of summer. It's us with good weather finally getting out and being able to work in the garden. But I think it's important that we really do recognize what Memorial Day is intended to be and what the day is all about. And it is a Memorial Day. It's really intended for us to take a moment and to remember all of those brave men and women who gave their life in support of our country. And so I want to leave that with you today. Having been a career military member, it has a particular meaning for me. I've lost people I knew during my time in the Air Force, and there are many thousands more that have helped us become who we are today because they died, in every case, too young. So as we spend the time today, hopefully outside in our garden, take a moment, if you would, just to give thanks to those who have come before. I know many gardeners who have a place in their garden and it's a memorial spot. And I think that's a great thing to design if you've got the space and the inclination, the desire to have a spot in your garden for whoever you want to remember, but a place you can go on a day like today and spend just a few moments remembering that person, remembering that ideal, remembering what they stood for. I think that's an important aspect that we should all be aware of and not lose sight of, especially on a day like today. That being said, of course, we do want to be outside enjoying our garden space and take full advantage of the opportunity. I hope the weather is good for you today. We've had some crazy tornado weather throughout the United States. I hope you all are safe and stay safe and your gardens are safe. And next week we can share some of what happened this week that's upcoming, because it'll be Monday. It'll be time to do it all over again, and I'll be back. Same time, same channel. Until next Monday, enjoy gardening.